Hello, and thank you for joining us here for Cherry Blossom Home Edition. The Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival takes place every year, the last weekend of April, here in Marshfield, Missouri. And it's our mission to preserve American history and to present it in a unique and interesting way. This year, due to the pandemic, we have moved our festival online and hope that you will enjoy the interviews and panels that we have in store for you. Our moderator is no stranger to the Cherry Blossom Festival. She just rarely makes an appearance on the Cherry Blossom stage. I know that you're going to enjoy hearing from her. In my house, we call her the boss. The Cherry Blossom Festival, we call her the First Lady of the festival. Please enjoy Sara Inman.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining me. My name is Sara Inman, and I am so happy to be here with you today, and just very excited about the guest that I have. So I'd like to introduce Sara Sands, who is the widow of a dear friend at the Cherry Blossom Festival, Jonathan Sands, who was the great-grandson of Winston Churchill. And that's really how we became acquainted with him and his family. He was able to come here and speak. He did our first state dinner, and we just fell in love with him and his whole family. Unfortunately, recently, Jonathan passed away, but he left such an amazing legacy with Sara and with their two children, Jesse and Arizona Jane. So what was so unique about Jonathan and Sara's relationship is because they kind of shared Churchill, and they kind of shared the legacy of his great-grandfather as a family. And so what I really want to do today is bring in Sara to talk about somebody maybe we haven't heard about, and that is Clementine Churchill. So Sara, if you'd like to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about Clementine.
Thank you so much, Sara. Sara is, we call each other the Saras when we're at Cherry Blossom Festival. We can't wait to find each other because for those of you watching and who have never experienced what the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival actually is in person, it is just the most insanely happy, crazy time. Slice of small town America, and it's just like the entire world of American history and media just sort of descends. And so Sara is, we call her affectionately the First Lady of the Cherry Blossom Festival, and she very much herself is a Clementine in the way that she supports Nicholas during in what's usually a really insane week. So we have been friends from the minute that I was sitting at work 10 years ago and my phone rang and I heard Nicholas say, "This is Nicholas Inman from the Cherry Blossom Festival," and I had no idea what it was. But in all the years that we've been coming, we've become family with everyone because we all share something really unique, and that is that we're all related to history, and that puts us all in a really unique position. So we've been able to grow really close. So anybody who's watching right now who has never experienced this, I highly recommend that next year, when all of this pandemonium is over, that you will come and join us in Missouri and experience this for yourself. So anyway, it is my honor and my pleasure to be here and to be launching what is the inaugural interview in the Jonathan Sands history series here at the Cherry Blossom Festival. There was no greater passion that my husband had than history and teaching it and making it accessible to people of all ages and all walks of life. And so
I love that.
Yeah. So,
and when you say we're all a family because we're all related to history, what an amazing, my goodness, I'm going to use that. That is great. We're all a family because we're all related to the same history. That's just beautiful. And if I can here, I'd like to just share a picture of Jonathan just so people at home can get a reference of who we're speaking about. And once you see his smile, you're going to know how amazing he was. So there's Jonathan and Sara, and then little Jesse there.
Yes.
So you actually, so Jonathan was, of course, well, not only was he English, but you guys went over to England quite often, and you
Mhm.
actually did kind of a behind the scenes tour with people who wanted to learn more about Churchill. And is that how you really got involved with Clementine's history?
That is how I got involved. And funny enough, it started that history. So much of it is housed in Missouri. Just a few hours north of Marshfield is the National Churchill Museum. For those of you watching that don't know, America does have a National Churchill Museum. The famous Iron Curtain speech that Churchill gave, where he talked about communism descending like an iron curtain across the European continent after the end of World War II. That was actually given at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and that is where the National Churchill Archives are housed. Now, there are National Churchill Archives, obviously, in England, and so you're probably wondering what the heck could possibly be in Fulton, Missouri, that shouldn't be sort of in the Cabinet War Rooms in England. And a lot of what was given to the National Churchill Archives here in America were the personal correspondences, family letters that were written back and forth between Winston Churchill, Clementine Churchill, and personal family friends of theirs. So a lot of the state papers and things that had to do with all of the political events that Churchill was involved with, those are in England. Most of those are in England. But what you guys have in your own state of Missouri is a really fascinating insight and a lot of the evidence that that Clementine was an instrumental part, not in just running the household so Churchill could run the country, but in being his advisor, his confidant. She affected policy in ways that a lot of people aren't aware of. But to kind of circle back to where you were talking about the tours, the very first sort of tour that was given with some former Cherry Blossom guests as well, the Gatchells. And Sarah, if you want to talk just a little bit about Tyler and Molly, and who they are to Cherry Blossom.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, we're very excited about them. They've come multiple times. They actually represent the Monroe family. So they're descendants and they're pretty much the nation's leading experts on President Monroe. And so you guys were able to meet at the Cherry Blossom Festival. We host anywhere upwards of 20 to 27 presidential families here at the Cherry Blossom Festival every April. And so it's so funny that maybe not in the case of Monroe, but many of the presidents had interactions with Churchill.
Yes.
And so I know that Jonathan and you were able to speak to them and kind of say, well, what did your great-grandfather say about my great-grandfather? Well, that's not what I heard. Well, that's not what the history book says. And then all of a sudden we have the conversations that went on behind the scenes. And so it's so fun that you guys, you know, we're able to meet up with that family and then go to Europe together and explore, you know, the war rooms and things like that. So cool.
So on that trip, the reason we were actually there was Jonathan was invited by the Chinese state television network, CCTV. It's actually the largest television network on the globe. They were sort of happy because with the time difference for the royal wedding, and we're talking about Princess Catherine and Prince William's wedding in 2011, with the onset of that, you know, China is still very much a communist country in name, and it's a country that's been in the news obviously recently, and there's a lot of things that we don't know about them and that they don't know about us because of those differences that Churchill talked about in Missouri back in the 50s. So the late 50s, or the early 50s, sorry. So we were there because Jonathan had been invited to commentate by a dear friend named James Chow, who no longer works for CCTV, but he was sort of their Dan Rather. the Dan Rather of China. He was their most noted news anchor. And so some of the photos that I sent you earlier of where we were sequestered there for the royal wedding, and the next day after that, we took the Gatchells to Churchill's home in Kent, in Chartwell. So a lot of people think that, Churchill lived most of his life in London, and that's actually not true. His dream home that he bought without Clementine's permission or knowledge.
No.
Yes, it was, yeah. So if all of us sitting at home can imagine what we would have done if our significant others had purchased a house an hour outside of the city without consulting us, that's frustrating enough. What's even more frustrating is that he did consult Clementine about this house purchase, and she said no, and he did it anyway. So, Clementine had to become a very good sport and had to be very flexible when it came to her husband's impulses. So Churchill was a polymath in every sense of the word. He painted 537 paintings. He wrote 40 books. He was prime minister twice. And the only reason he was not prime minister 3 times is he did not take Clementine's advice. And when he was up for re-election, after he won the war, he was at the zenith of his political career, and he was up for re-election as prime minister. And one of the great questions that historians have posed for so many years is, why did he lose? Why, at the height of his popularity, did Churchill lose to an opponent that represented the same party that we just defeated in World War II in many ways? And what a lot of historians don't know, because so many of these archival letters are buried in the personal correspondence, and what we were able to find is that it was actually Clementine who had advised him not to use a particular language in his campaign material, where he likened the opposing party to Gestapo. And it was she said, that's really, we're not far removed enough from that conflict and from the Holocaust and from, all of that. And I don't know that that's really going to go over well. And I think it's going to cost you dearly. And it was the one time that he did not listen to her and take her advice besides the house purchase. And it ended up costing him the election. So.
Wow. So he was prime minister from 1940 to 1945. And so you are referencing that second term that he would have had in 1945. He went on to be prime minister again a second term in 1951. And so you really feel like that second election was lost because Churchill didn't take Clementine's advice.
Yes. Yeah, and it's more than a feeling. So Clementine and Churchill were separated by schedules and by geography for so much of their marriage. In fact, she was Scottish and lived in Scotland. Her maiden name was Hosier, and they met at a party. And he was so taken with her that he was very socially awkward as a person. And that's where some of these really, really funny Churchill quotes come from, and the wit that he is so famous for. A lot of it came from just his social awkwardness, and he didn't really, he was so good with words. He always had something ready to say, and he wasn't quite cognizant of how it affected other people around him sometimes. And so which anybody who knew the namesake of this historical interview series can say that is a definite family trait.
Oh, absolutely.
So, but when they met, he was so taken with her that he was truly, for one of the very few, if not only times in his life, at a loss for words. And she misinterpreted that to be a lack of interest or just outright rudeness, which is not unlike mine and Jonathan's first meeting. And after he and I met for the first time, I did not like him. He did not like me. And then we met a second time a few days later, With Winston and Clementine, it actually ended up being 4 years before they would meet again. And
Oh.
when Winston found out that he was going to be at a party with Clementine Hosier, he changed the place cards to ensure that he would be sitting across from her. And he used that opportunity to sort of redeem himself with her, and they were married shortly thereafter. And Jonathan and I were married just a few short months after our second meeting. So we say it's a love at second sight story.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but yeah, no, they would write letters back and forth a lot of the time, even when they were in the same home with each other, even when they were both home at Chartwell. And this is actually what a lot of what is housed in the Churchill Archives in Fulton, Missouri, are these letters that they would write, particularly after they would have a conflict. Churchill often found it easier to put his emotions and his feelings into words, and that was something that Jonathan and I actually used in our marriage. I've got stacks and stacks and stacks of letters of ours that we would write. Churchill's youngest surviving daughter, Mary, who passed away sadly a few years ago, she took up the mantle and she wrote an exhaustive compilation of her parents' love letters. And it's called To Winston from Clemmy with Love. And I believe is the name of the book. I'll have to look it up and see. But that's a wonderful compilation of all of their letters and things back and forth to one another. And so if they would have an argument, get in a tiff about something, which was often, because Churchill was not an easy person to live with. He struggled with mental illness. He struggled with depression. He struggled with a lot of different issues, and just the burden of his schedule alone when he was a statesman was enough. I think one of the hardest times in their lives were in the 30s, when he was one of the only ones that was sort of saying, this is coming, war is coming, and we're not prepared. And those words ring really prescient today as we sit here. And the reason why we're talking on Zoom right now is because this is the first global crisis that we have faced in our history since World War II. And unfortunately, there were select groups of people that were shouting and saying, this is happening, this is going to happen, and we found ourselves woefully unprepared. I love your cherry blossom pink. We always try and wear something that's cherry blossom pink, Sarah. I've got my cherry blossom pink. But I'm wearing white in solidarity with our healthcare workers and our frontline workers today who are out there helping to fight this pandemic. There's no other time in human history that we have needed to unify under one cause more urgently. And that's the cause of making sure that we're all taken care of and that we're taking care of each other. Clementine really did help lead the charge during the war years for that. She, the things that we did at home, sort of planning victory gardens and keeping things, going at home. She really did that. Some of her most, I would think, beneficial influence that she had on Churchill's career was the secretaries that he had that worked in the cabinet war rooms with him. They actually reached out to Clementine at one point. So the cabinet war rooms, for those of you who don't know, actually weren't even open to the public up to about 15 years ago. They were covered under the State Secrets Act. They were tunnels in an entire, literally government building that was built underneath number 10 Downing Street. And it's connected via tunnels between number 10 and you go underground. And so during the Blitz and during the darkest days that London was facing in World War II, this is where the government, including Churchill, would go. Now, Churchill was famous for throwing himself into the face of danger. So it took everybody, all of his bodyguards and everybody, to keep him down there and he would like to go up on the roof and look and watch the bombs fall himself over London. So he had a bedroom there. Clementine had a bedroom there, although she hated staying and she rarely slept. In fact, I think she slept there maybe once or twice in her bedroom. But Jonathan actually proposed to me in Churchill's bedroom, and he got a little miffed at me after he asked if I would do anything differently. And it was actually, we were right there behind the desk when he did it. And so far as we know, we're the only couple to have ever gotten engaged in the cabinet war rooms. But he asked me if I was disappointed at all in the way that he proposed, or if there was anything that I would change. And I said, well, there's one thing, I just hate to say it. And Sara, you just put up a photo of what is yours and mine, because you've been there too. What is our favorite room in the cabinet rooms, and that's actually the map room. And that is where, believe it or not, we talk about the global coronavirus crisis, and we can pull up on our smartphones right now and we can see maps of hotspots and what local authorities are doing to combat this virus, this unseen enemy that we're all unified up against. But in 1942, we didn't have that technology. What you see there is a map, and it was from that room that the entire war effort was tracked, organized, and run. That long bank of that's in the middle of the room is filled with telephones, and there were more female employees that worked in that room supporting the war effort than anywhere else in the English government at the time, with the exception of perhaps Bletchley Park, where the Enigma machine was. So what you're seeing there is, you're seeing sort of a wax figure of a clerk sitting there, and those phones would ring 24/7, and there was the 13 color pin code, push pin code. And on that map, if you run your fingers across it, you can feel literally hundreds of thousands of perforations in the map itself. And every second there was a pin that was being moved that represented a convoy of ships, or a squadron of airplanes coming over from Germany, or whatever it may be, Allied forces and Axis forces, anything that was, and that's how the war was ran and tracked. And so the fact that they could run a global war like that from a room like that is just, it's a testament to what can happen when humanity pulls together for one cause. So
absolutely, I love that, and I encourage anybody to go to the war rooms. The wait time is crazy. There's always thousands of people there. I think we were in line for about 3 or 4 hours. Yeah. But by far one of the best things that we did while we were there, because it really gives you a feel, that underground bunker, it really gives you a feel of the fear and what everybody was dealing with at the time. And like you said, archives galore. My goodness, too much information to absorb, but amazing.
There are more books written about Winston Churchill than any other figure in history, with the exception of Jesus Christ. So yeah, there is a lot about him out there.
Wow. And him and Clementine were married from 1908 to 1965. So they were married about 57 years. And something in talking to you in the past, something that you've always said was Clementine kept him grounded. Now, when I think of Churchill, I don't think of him, I mean, of course he knew he was dignified and he knew what he brought to the table, but what do you mean when you say she kept him grounded?
So Churchill was a man of action. He was an ideologue. He was, if you know, we don't know, we didn't have the facts about, you know, how the brain works and any kind of mental issues back then that we do now. But he would have these episodes of real high productive mania, and then he would have what he would call his black dog days. So there was really no medium. There was no moderation with Churchill. And the case in point is one of the few positions that Churchill ever truly failed on his own in was when he was named Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is sort of like our Secretary of the Treasury in America. And Churchill was terrible with money, horrible with money. He died broke. His friends after the war actually had to purchase his house in Chartwell in Kent for him, just so he could continue living there. till the end of his life because he was born in Europe's largest palace. You know, he was literally born in the lap of luxury. He may have been the son of an American mother, but she herself was wealthy. Jenny Jerome came from a wealthy family, and he was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill. So he was born in his family's, and that is his family's home. That's the Churchill's family's home in Blenheim, is Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. And he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But there were many times that he craved the intimacy and the closeness that he saw middle and lower class families have with their families. Being born into high society in Victorian England, you didn't really get to see much of your parents. But his mother actually took much more of an active role in her husband's political career, and also her son's one after her husband passed away. And one of the ways that Clementine kept Churchill grounded was during the 30s, when Churchill was doing nothing but sitting at home. He had no position in government. Nobody was listening to him and his warnings about Germany. He was, we sort of call that period, historians call that period the wilderness years, the period between his first premiership and his, when he was sort of exiled from Parliament after the government lost the election, after the stock market crashed. Churchill also lost quite a bit of money in the stock market crash as well. So for those of us who have suffered economic losses during this time, just remember that Churchill still saved the world and died broke. So
Hey, there's hope for us.
There's hope for everyone. There's hope for everyone. But they had an accountant in London, and Clementine noticed that some checks were being returned to Chartwell unpaid. So she decided to take matters. She had a suspicion and why that was happening. And so she went to see the accountant in London and asked what was going on. And he looked at the checks and he took his glasses off and sort of shook his head, put his head in his hands, and he said, I warned Winston that this would happen if he didn't curb his spending habits. And when she asked him, you know, and what did he reply, because she pretty much knew what he was going to reply at that point. The accountant said he promised to cut down from from 3 bottles of champagne in the evening to 2. And yeah, and so and Clementine was not born into the lap of luxury, so she had a much better sense of how to economize than he did. So that's exactly what she did. She went straight home, and she told Winston that she immediately cleaned house, tightened the belt, and said, right, you can only have this. She pulled his favorite thing besides champagne and cigars out of the pantry, and it was a treat called Dundee cake, and it was made in Scotland, and it was Churchill's favorite thing to have with tea every afternoon, but it was very expensive. And so she said, you may only have this when we have guests for tea. Churchill would go to London every week and invite anybody that he possibly could. He spent the next several weeks filling his calendar for tea every day.
Oh, no. So she tried to keep him grounded and did her very best, but
there were times in which even he was too much even for she. So yeah.
Was Clementine political at all? Did she offer advice as far as that goes? How well educated was she? Did she bring anything to the table that way?
She brought many things to the table. She helped. You can look back in their correspondence and you can see where Clementine was really useful for Churchill. And this was something that I really enjoyed doing for Jonathan as well, because Jonathan, that's how he made his living, was giving speeches and writing books. And so he would give me his speeches to read and go over. And Clementine and I were both really well suited to making these minor adjustments in the language, in the verbiage, and how things were delivered, and sort of behind the scenes and finishing touches is what I like to say. In the culture in the culture that Clementine grew up in, and even in our culture, and so many of our cherry blossom friends will tell us this, that are part of these presidential families, and so many of the first ladies that we've had have said these same things as well. There's not been, until recently, there's really not been a place for us, and it was considered bad form to be public, to take a position on things, and especially to take a position that was different than our husbands. The first lady that ever did that in this country was Barbara Bush. So it was only 30 years ago that we had a first lady that was able to dissent and sort of have her own views about things and speak publicly about them. And even then, she faced significant backlash, not from her husband or family, but obviously from the media, from society, and things like that. So in England, it's considered, even today, you notice you don't see prime ministers' wives, or you don't really know who the first lady of England is. So in English culture, women who are sort of married into power stay silent and stay behind the scenes, and they exert their influence that way, which isn't to say you can't be just as influential. One of my dear friends and mentors here, Joanne King Herring, whom Julia Roberts played her in the movie Charlie Wilson's War. She is a perfect example of how a woman can function and exact change. She helped end the Cold War by her actions, but she did so by hosting parties that brought certain people that were in power together, that she knew if she could get them in the same room, that good things would happen and that her goals would be accomplished. And so Clementine did that herself in many ways. Being a hostess, being sort of, you hear about Nancy Reagan being sort of that type of hostess, and that was very much Clementine as well. Clementine was very good at helping the people that also supported Churchill understand who he was as a person. So like when his secretaries reached out to her and said, we really are having a difficult time working with him because he could be very gruff, he could be very short. His mind was always on something massive and huge and way up here in the air. And so his feet, and his head was in the clouds, his feet were never really on the ground. And so Clementine, actually, one of the things that helped equip his secretaries down there in the cabinet works to do their job was a letter that she wrote him counseling that Churchill to be kinder, to be more mindful of tone of voice and how he spoke to them and how he was coming across. And one of the things that I love that she said in that particular letter, and I'm not going to quote it exactly because I don't have it memorized exactly, but she said that the reason why that she was pointing this out to him wasn't to be critical, that she knew how much he had on his mind and on his plate, and that she knew how more intimately than anybody how he struggled just to get through the days sometimes because of his depression. And she said, I am saying this to you, and I'm encouraging you and urging you to be kinder and to be nicer, because I know what a wonderful man you are and what a wonderful person you are, and I would hate for anybody else not to be able to see that in you as well, and to see the kind, wonderful, caring, considerate person that I know you to be. And her concern was that other people just wouldn't see what she saw out of anybody on the planet. We all think we all know how wonderful Churchill was, but there's nobody on the planet that really knew him better than she did. So
absolutely. And I love how eloquent that you discuss that, because that's true. When you have a husband in political office, he has to be a certain way. He has to exert power. And, he was a bit gruff. We've heard that in accounts from people all throughout history. But her taking her role and knowing I have limitations, I can only do so much. So what I can do, I'm going to do the very best I can. I'm going to get as much for it. You know, if I host a party, I'm going to make sure that I can do what I can do to help my husband. And yeah, those poor secretaries, I'm pretty sure they had to deal with, you know, I can't even imagine, but her just behind the scenes, like, you know, guys, he's a great guy, and kind of humanizing him a little bit. And so people would understand him better. And so that's wonderful.
Yes. Yeah.
Churchill and Clementine had 5 children.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about, as we wrap up a little bit, you want to talk about how she was as a mother and what she did to influence her children?
Oh, absolutely. Clementine was, you know, she was a woman of her time. But she was a hands-on mother in the sense that so much love and care. Anybody that's ever been to Chartwell, their home, can see all of the love and the care. It truly is a home. It's not like Blenheim Palace, where he was born and where the Duke of Marlborough, my husband's cousin, lives now. But it's not cold and sort of, you know, removed. It's warm. You can see a family living there, and you can see her influences and touches all around. There is a little brick house in the back garden. Churchill actually laid all the bricks. He didn't hire people to do the work for him. He wanted to build the brick walls around his garden, so he's the one that did that. And as he was doing that, he built a little playhouse for their youngest daughter, Mary, and it's called Mary Cott, on the grounds. Diana is their oldest child, their oldest daughter, and that's actually Jonathan's grandmother. She married Lord Duncan Sands, who helped develop the V2 rockets. He was the Churchill's Secretary of Defense, I believe, during the war, and he helped develop the V2 rocket program. And so he ended up marrying Churchill's eldest daughter, Diana, and then they had my husband's father, Julian, and then his sisters, Celia, who most people are familiar with Celia because she's the one in the family that's been the most outspoken in modern times. And then Edwina, Missourians will know Edwina from the National Churchill Museum, the pieces of the Berlin Wall that came down that are there. Edwina actually carved those, and she's an artist, and she splits her time between the UK and the US, but she actually carved those herself, and that's her exhibit that's there. And so Jonathan grew up just south of London, in sort of the countryside, so to speak, but lived most of his adult life in London, and then we met when we were over here in Houston. But Clementine, they had one child who died before she was 5 years old. And a lot of the time, women before, you know, the 1950s are criticized for sort of being these hands-off mothers. But to put into perspective what it means when any mother loses a child, Churchill wrote in his journal the day that Marigold, the child that they lost, passed, that he's never in all of his travels heard any animal wail more mournfully or more forcefully than Clementine did when she got the news that Marigold was dead. And that is probably one of the most humanizing things that I can say about her as a mother, that she truly did care for their children. And there's a photo that I sent you of even Jonathan. She was at Jonathan's christening, and there's a photo of Jonathan as a baby sitting on her lap, and she was very involved in even her great-grandchildren's lives up to the day that she died.
Yeah, and so I pulled that up so that people could see he's very faint in her arms.
Yeah.
But she passed away in 1977, so she got to know Jonathan for 2 years, which is kind of nice. So this is him and his siblings.
Yes.
That there. So what a beautiful picture that you have.
Yes.
And it occurs to me when you're talking about the home that they built together for their children and the playhouse, that even now, even today, when people go and see that, she is still softening his image and she is still humanizing him. By making this home, we realize he went home to a family. And so I think that's kind of profound. So, the last thing that I want to talk about is Jonathan's book. And I have a photo of that I'll be putting up here. Jonathan, not long before he passed away, he actually published this book and was very excited about it. It's an excellent book. And so if you want to talk about that for a moment, I will put up that photo so people can see the cover. And it's called God and Churchill. Or as Jonathan would say, God and Churchill, which I loved when he speaks to me with his accent. So kind of talk about the development of this and the research that went into this book.
So Jonathan, the thing that impressed me the most, one of the things that always impressed me the most about Jonathan as a person was how devoted he was to getting everything right, getting the facts right, not what we would like to believe about Winston Churchill, or not what we've been led to believe about Winston Churchill, but what actually was and is true, and what the facts are. And what this book does is it gives the reader a sort of intimate look into Churchill's spiritual life and what influenced some of his decision making in the policy, whether that policy making was good or bad. You get a really in-depth look at the sort of philosophy and worldview that influenced him and that guided him all throughout his life. Jonathan spent months, and I thought he was absolutely insane. We definitely had a Winston and Clementine moment when he announced that he was going to devote every waking minute to writing a book. 2 weeks after I had our first child. So, but he made it happen, and I was never prouder of him than when he was able to get all of that hard-born research. We actually traveled to England to meet with Churchill's official biographer, Martin Gilbert, and a fellow Houstonian former Secretary of State, James Baker, who has his own Institute of Public Policy at Rice University, now here in Houston, wrote the foreword to the book. So it's a very well-researched book. It was co-written by a dear friend of ours and executive pastor at one of the largest congregations in the nation, Second Baptist Church here in Houston, Dr. Wallace Henley. So that I encourage you, as we're sitting here in pandemic quarantine, if you would like an intimate look that's really never been seen outside of this book. It's been a really difficult subject, and a subject that historians haven't really wanted to tackle. But Jonathan, in his truest form, no challenge was too big, really, for him.
Let's do it. Exactly.
So I'll make sure and post a link to the Amazon site for that, for anybody that wants to purchase that and need some light reading during quarantine.
Yeah, there we go. And you had mentioned that anybody who leaves a question or a comment below will actually be entered into a raffle for a book to be sent to them, a free book to be sent to them. So I want to encourage everybody who's watching, if you have a question for Sara, about Clementine or about Winston, drop that in the comments and you'll be entered in that raffle for this free book. It's a beautiful book, and he spent a lot of heart and soul and time on it, that's for sure.
Yeah, so, I will, and it's something I'll write a personal message inside and send to whoever. So every question, every engagement underneath this video, it counts for one entry. So there's no question, there's no such thing as a dumb question, there's no such thing. I'm literally sitting in a house full of notes and archives and research. So I whatever you would like to know, just hit me up in the comments. I'm going to start speaking here a lot more now, hopefully in the future, once this pandemic is over. So you'll start to see me out there a lot more talking about this. But yeah, so especially now during the pandemic. So if Winston Churchill had anything to say to us now, it would be he relied on scientists, and he relied on really, really smart people. He actually predicted cell phones before they were ever a thing. He predicted the technology. He helped the technology that he helped develop to pass encoded messages during the war was actually used all the way up through the Cold War and the Cold War, and the code was never broken. And it was actually Churchill who helped develop the National Health Service and gave England their National Health Service because the country was so economically devastated. So Churchill's number one priority, no matter what, was always taking care of the people. And so I think if he were here today, that's exactly what he would say, is he would listen to people that are smarter than we are when it comes to battling this unseen enemy. Listen to the people that have been saying the same thing for a long, long time, and then take care of each other. Do what they say and take care of each other. That's all, because each other is all we have. So
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Sara, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on Cherry Blossom Festival Home Edition and doing this virtual interview with us. I'm so excited to see you next year here in Marshfield.
You too, Sara. Y'all take care, stay healthy, and never surrender.
Yay! Thank you very much. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
In closing, we'd like to thank all of you again for watching, and we'd like to encourage you to stay connected to the Cherry Blossom Festival through our Facebook page and website. Our Facebook page is Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival in Marshfield, Mo, and our website is cherryblossomfest.com. There you'll find more panels and interviews and pictures representing the best of American history. And we hope to see all of you here in Marshfield next year as we celebrate the 15th Cherry Blossom Festival.